I'm a Jim Carrey, how a little Canadian bum turned into the rubber face of Hollywood. If you think Jim Carrey was always living in mansions, polishing Oscars, and flashing that toothpaste commercial smile on red carpets, you're very wrong. In reality, the story begins in such a way that even the heroes of Trailer Park Boys would raise an eyebrow. Little James Eugene Carrey was born on January 17, 1962, in the sleepy Canadian town of Newmarket, Ontario. What could possibly go wrong in a place where the highlight of the week is Mass at the Catholic school and a trip to the dollar store? Well, as it turns out, everything. Jim's mum, Kathleen, was a former singer. His dad, Percy, a saxophone player turned accountant. Imagine the household. One day it's tax forms, the next it's arias. For a while the family lived relatively normal, until Dad lost his job. That's when the roller coaster dropped. Picture this. Instead of moving into a cozy little house with a white picket fence, the Carreys crammed themselves into a beat-up Volkswagen van. Sometimes even a tent in a park became home. Call it luxury camping, only without Wi-Fi, and with the creeping realization that this wasn't a vacation. This was rock bottom. Jim and his brother worked night shifts at a factory, mopping floors and acting as part-time security guards, not because they dreamed of climbing the corporate janitorial ladder, but because someone had to pay for food. And here we start to see the origin story of that wild comedy style. When your teenage years smell of industrial detergent and despair, you either cry or you make insane faces until everyone laughs. Jim picked option 2. School? Forget it. By 16 he was done. Not because he thought he was too cool for classrooms, but because rent and groceries didn't pay themselves. He went to work, leaving behind math lessons for the privilege of sweeping factory floors. The classic biography recipe. If you think you had it tough, meet Jim Carrey. Still, even as a kid, he loved performing. He would stand in front of the mirror, twisting his face into bizarre contortions, parodying celebrities he barely even understood. At 10 years old, he wrote a letter to comedy icon Carol Burnett, praising his own talent for impressions. "And miracle of miracles," she replied. Okay, it was a generic, "Thanks for your letter, kid, we believe in you." But for a boy living in a van, that's basically a golden ticket from Willy Wonka. At 15, Carrey thought he was ready for the big leagues. He hit the stage at a Toronto comedy club, and bombed so hard the audience probably still tells their grandchildren about it. His jokes landed like a commercial for yogurt at a funeral. The room sat in silence, and Jim slinked off, swearing never to perform again. For 2 years he stuck to that promise. Most people would have quit for good. But Jim wasn't most people. He came back, and when he did, he came back with such explosive energy that the whole country had to ask, is this a human being? Or did a Looney Tunes character just escape from a Saturday morning cartoon? Here's the thing. His mother was often sick and depressed, and Jim's way of coping was to make her laugh. Imagine a gloomy night in that cramped van, his mom lying in bed, and little Jim doing the human equivalent of fireworks just to see her crack a smile. That's where the madness was born, the exaggerated expressions, the manic physical comedy, the desperate drive to get a reaction. Later in life, Jim told a story about his dad. Percy had the talent to be a professional musician, but he played it safe, became an accountant. And then he got fired anyway. That's when Jim realized something fundamental. You can fail at something you don't even like. So you might as well take the risk and fail at something you love. Honestly, that's not just a life lesson. That's practically a religion. For Carrey, it was the spark that lit the dynamite of his career. So what do we end up with? A teenager scrubbing toilets and sweeping factory floors who should have statistically ended up stuck in the middle class at best, but instead morphed into Hollywood's ultimate rubber face. He made millions off the fact that his head could bend, twist, and explode in ways that defied biology. One minute he's the Mask, the next he's Ace Ventura, Then he's the guy in The Cable Guy who makes you want to hide your phone number. The irony, of course, is that his tragic childhood is exactly what gave him his brilliance. If Jim Carrey had grown up in a suburban home with ice cream after dinner and a backyard trampoline, there's no way we'd have gotten the same lunatic who ruled the box office in the 1990s. The pain made the clown. And that's the paradox of his early years. The worse his life got, the funnier he became. The more desperate the circumstances, the more outrageous his performances. It's as if the universe decided, we'll make your teenage years miserable, but in exchange, you'll become a legend whose face can turn into a live-action cartoon at will. A terrible trade for a normal person, but for Jim, it worked. So, what's the moral of this whole saga? That you can sleep in a van, mop factory floors, get booed off stage at 15, and still end up one of the most famous comedians in the world. Jim Carrey's story is less about Hollywood glamour and more about survival, transformation, and the bizarre power of laughter. Even in his biggest blockbuster roles, you can feel that energy. The boy in the van trying to make his mother laugh. Every exaggerated expression, every insane punchline, it all comes from that same place of desperation and hope. That's why his comedy never felt like just jokes. It felt like a battle cry. And that's the part people often miss. When you see Jim Carrey on screen, pulling faces like his jaws made of rubber, he's not just entertaining you. He's fighting against the memory of poverty, homelessness, and humiliation. He already lost once, back when he lived in that Volkswagen. Everything else that came after was just bonus rounds. So yes, Jim Carrey's childhood was rough, tragic, and messy. But without it, we wouldn't have Ace Ventura talking out of his butt, or Stanley Ipkiss turning into a green-faced maniac, or even Truman Burbank realizing his entire life was a TV show. His pain became our comedy. His poverty became our box office gold. In the end, the story of Jim Carrey is the perfect Hollywood parable. The boy who lived in a van and worked night shifts to feed his family grew up to be the man who could make the entire planet laugh. Not because he had it easy, but because he didn't. And that's the real trick. Laughter born out of survival. Jim Carrey didn't just become a movie star. He became proof that sometimes the funniest people are forged in the darkest places. He went from homeless kid to Hollywood legend, and he did it with nothing but a rubber face and a stubborn refusal to quit. Jim Carrey, from Canadian bum to Hollywood gold. It's hard to believe that one of the richest and most recognizable actors in Hollywood once slept in a van. Yes, that same guy who made the whole world laugh in the 90s with Ace Ventura and The Mask once lived a life that looked more like the script of a social drama than a fairy tale. The story begins in the quiet Canadian town of Newmarket. The Carrey family lived modestly, but nothing too catastrophic. His father, Percy, was an accountant and a self-taught musician, his mother a former singer. On the surface, they were an ordinary middle-class family. But when Dad lost his job, that middle-class image collapsed faster than the ratings of a box office flop. Instead of a cozy house, the family received a new residence address, an old Volkswagen van. Imagine going to school while your home is parked in a lot. No Netflix, no Wi-Fi, at best a cassette player that eats up the ABBA tape. Sometimes they even camped out in a tent in the park. And no, this wasn't a romantic, let's go camping trip, but the kind of hopelessness where you just pray not to freeze at night. But here's the absurd part. Little Jim found humor in all this misery. He entertained his mother, who suffered from illness and depression. He made faces, mimicked neighbors and teachers, and turned the family van into a free comedy club. At that time, he wasn't thinking about Hollywood. He was just trying to save his family from despair. Now fast forward. The boy who once slept in a van and mopped floors at a factory grew up into an actor who earned $20 million per movie. From a rusty Volkswagen to Beverly Hills mansions. From nights in a park tent to Golden Globes and red carpet spotlights. The transformation is so extreme it could replace every motivational seminar on Earth. Because when you sit in a tent thinking, "That's it, life is over," remember Jim. A man who not only escaped poverty, but turned his miserable past into fuel for his career. His wild facial expressions and manic energy weren't born out of comfort. They came from pain, exhaustion, and desperation. And that's exactly what made him unique. The irony of fate is that without this dirt-poor childhood, we might never have known Jim Carrey's rubber face. He could have ended up like his dad, a safe, quiet accountant. Stable, boring, unremarkable. But his father's firing and the family van instead of a home flipped everything upside down. Jim realized one simple truth. You can fail even at something you don't like. So why not risk failing at something you love? Today it's almost surreal to think that the man once on the edge of homelessness became part of Hollywood's golden circle. But that's what makes his story so gripping. Jim Carrey is living proof that even if life throws you into a van, you still have a chance to end up on the red carpet. Jim Carrey. How his first step on stage turned into a total disaster today. We know Jim Carrey as a laughter machine, a man whose face can replace an entire cartoon and whose movies in the 90s brought in millions. But few people remember that Carrey's very first encounter with the stage ended not with applause, but with a collapse so painful it could make even a clown cry. He was 15 years old. That magical age when you think the world is waiting for you with open arms and that your jokes are so funny they'll probably crown you the next king of comedy. Young Jim stepped onto the stage of a Toronto comedy club, glowing with confidence as if he were about to revolutionize humor. But within minutes, it became clear that the only thing he might revolutionize was spilling a glass of water on stage. The audience sat stone-faced. Jokes that killed at home landed here with the grace of wet napkins hitting the floor. Instead of laughter, there was silence and awkward coughing. At one point, Jim realized the crowd wasn't just not with him. They were against him. According to legend, the silence was so heavy you could hear the hum of a refrigerator in the next room. That's how dead the atmosphere was. For a teenager, this was a blow worse than failing algebra. Most kids would have buried that microphone, gone to stack boxes at a warehouse, and sworn never to perform again. And Jim did swear. He promised himself he would never set foot on stage again. For 2 years, he didn't even attempt public comedy. But here's the twist. That silence, that humiliation, became the fuel for his future rise. Think about it. How stubborn do you have to be to come back to the very place where people practically booed you into oblivion? Most people would avoid a stage for life after one taste of public humiliation. But Jim? He stepped back, licked his wounds, reflected, and prepared to return. The irony is that this failure is exactly what made him who he is. He learned the hard truth. Humor isn't about what makes you laugh in the mirror. Humor is about connection with the audience. It's about risking looking like a complete fool and not being afraid of it. His first flop taught him that if you can survive humiliation in a silent room where nobody supports you, then there's nothing left to fear. You could say that this catastrophic debut acted like a vaccine. After it, Carrey wasn't scared of failing anymore, and so when he came back to comedy clubs in the late 70s, he was bulletproof. His manic energy, his improvisations, his elastic grimaces, all of that was born out of that one night where the audience answered him not with laughter, but with deadly silence. So yes, Jim Carrey's first stand-up was a disaster. But if the audience had laughed, maybe he would never have become the wild man we love. Because real comedians aren't born out of applause, they're born out of failure, and Jim's failure was so crushing that the only way forward was up. Jim Carrey, the day a Hollywood millionaire cut his own paycheck. In Hollywood, there's an unwritten rule. You never say no to millions. If the studio is willing to hand you a fat check, you grab it with both hands, hire a new lawyer, and maybe buy another mansion you'll never live in. But then came Jim Carrey, a guy so unpredictable that even money couldn't always control him. At the peak of his fame in the mid-90s, Carrey was the most expensive funny man in the business. Studios coughed up $20 million just to see him pull faces and scream in ways only Jim Carrey could. For The Mask, for Liar Liar, for Ace Ventura, the man was basically printing money with his jaw muscles. But then along came The Truman Show. And suddenly, Mr. Rubberface shocked everyone. He slashed his own fee from $20 million to a mere $12 million. Now, don't get me wrong, $12 million is still more than most of us could make in several lifetimes. But in Hollywood terms, this was practically charity work. Imagine a star quarterback saying, "Nah, I don't need 20 million this season. Just give me 12, I'll survive." Agents fainted, accountants cried, and studio executives started wondering if Carrey had lost his mind. But the truth was, Jim wasn't losing his mind. He was finally trying to find it. The Truman Show wasn't another rubber-faced comedy. It was something else. A smart, thought-provoking drama about a man whose entire life turned out to be a reality show. It needed subtlety, depth, and real acting chops. And Carrey wanted in so badly that he was willing to throw away $8 million just to prove he wasn't only the clown Hollywood thought he was. Director Peter Weir admitted later that working with Carrey wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Jim had script approval, meaning he could suggest changes whenever he wanted. For most directors, that's a nightmare. But Weir actually liked Jim's improvisational madness. For example, the now famous bathroom mirror scene. 100% Carrey's idea. What started as the studio's gamble on a comedian turned into a role that critics hailed as one of the best performances of the decade. And it paid off, not in cash, but in prestige. The Truman Show was showered with critical praise, landing an 8.5 out of 10 average score from film critics, and drawing comparisons to cultural landmarks like Forrest Gump. Roger Ebert, the high priest of movie reviews, gave it 4 stars and openly admitted he was impressed by Carrey's dramatic side. For Jim, the Golden Globe win that followed was sweeter than any oversized paycheck. Of course, some Hollywood insiders grumbled. "Why would you cut your salary?" they said, clutching their wallets. But Carrey didn't care. For him, this was about breaking free from typecasting, proving he could be more than a talking butt in Ace Ventura. It was about rewriting his career narrative. So yes, Jim Carrey gave up $8 million. But in exchange, he bought himself credibility, the kind of credibility no comedy paycheck could ever buy. And in the ruthless world of Hollywood, that turned out to be the best bargain of his life. Jim Carrey, the actor who forgot he was. Jim Carrey, Hollywood loves method actors. You know, those people who insist on living the role 24/7, making everyone around them miserable, just so they can later brag about their craft. But when Jim Carrey did it on the set of Man on the Moon, 1999, he didn't just go method. He went nuclear. The movie was supposed to be a biopic about the eccentric comedian Andy Kaufman. But somewhere along the line, it stopped being a film about Andy and became a film about Jim losing his damn mind. Carrey didn't just play Kaufman, he became him, and not in a cute, wow, he's really committed kind of way. No, Jim demanded everyone call him Andy. He showed up on set in character, stayed in character, and even hurled insults at the director, Milos Forman, as if bullying your boss was just another acting technique. Crew members didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or call a psychiatrist. According to Jim, he couldn't separate himself from the role. He admitted later, "When I finished, it took me a month to remember who I was." Imagine needing a month to remember your own name. That's not art. That's what happens when Halloween goes too far. To be fair, Carrey wasn't just being difficult for the sake of it. Kaufman himself was a prankster, a provocateur who blurred the line between reality and performance. Carrey wanted to honor that. The problem? Hollywood doesn't like it when the million-dollar star makes the set feel like a hostage situation. Years later, Martin Freeman, yes, the Hobbit guy, even trashed Carrey's performance on a podcast, calling it selfish, narcissistic, and amateur. In Freeman's words, Carrey should have been fired for being too much of a diva. Ouch. But here's the kicker. Carrey's insanity worked. The performance was so convincing that he walked away with another Golden Globe. Sure, the movie didn't exactly set the box office on fire, but Carrey got the critical validation he craved. Hollywood basically patted him on the back and said, "You're crazy, but at least you're award-winning crazy." The behind-the-scenes chaos was so wild that Universal Pictures actually tried to bury the footage. They didn't want the public to see Jim acting like a total lunatic. Fast forward to 2017, and Netflix released the documentary Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond. Suddenly, the world got to see Carrey's meltdown in glorious HD. In the film, Jim even admitted that the studio wanted to hide the tapes so people wouldn't think Jim is an asshole. Too late. So, was it genius or just a Hollywood tantrum dressed up as art? Probably both. Carrey pushed himself so deep into Kaufman that he nearly disappeared. For fans, it was another reminder that behind the rubber face and goofy characters was a man willing to risk his sanity for a role. For his colleagues, though, it was hell on earth. Bottom line, on Man on the Moon, Jim Carrey didn't just act. He hijacked reality, held it hostage, and forced everyone to play along. Whether you call it brilliant or bonkers, one thing's for sure. Nobody who worked on that film will ever forget it. By Jim Carrey. The footage. Hollywood didn't want you to see in Hollywood. Stars can get away with almost anything. Tantrums, diva behavior, even throwing telephones at assistants, as long as the audience never finds out. But when Jim Carrey went completely off the rails while filming Man on the Moon, the chaos was so outrageous that Universal Pictures pulled the ultimate cover-up. They literally tried to bury the evidence. On set, Carrey wasn't Jim anymore. He was Andy Kaufman, 24/7. He screamed at directors, insulted crew members, and behaved like the world's most expensive prankster. Cameras caught it all. Behind the scenes, there were hours of raw footage showing Carrey making life miserable for everyone in the name of art. And the studio panicked. Why? Because Jim Carrey wasn't just a comedian anymore, he was a $20 million franchise. If the public saw him acting like an unhinged lunatic, ticket sales for future films might nosedive. It's one thing to play a madman on screen, it's another to reveal you are one in real life. So Universal locked the tapes away, like a scandalous family secret. Officially, they wanted to protect Carrey's image. Translation: we don't want the world thinking Jim is an asshole. For nearly 2 decades, those tapes gathered dust. Fans only saw the polished product, Carrey's Golden Globe-winning performance as Kaufman. They didn't see the screaming matches, the bizarre Kaufman-style stunts, or Carrey diving so deep into character he practically needed a rescue team to pull him out. But Hollywood secrets never stay buried forever. In 2017, Netflix released the documentary Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond, and suddenly the world got front-row seats to Carrey's meltdown. The footage was jaw-dropping. Carrey didn't just act like Kaufman, he terrorized his castmates. He even admitted, with a straight face, that the studio buried the tapes to save his reputation. And then, in the most Carrey way possible, he added, "So people wouldn't think Jim is an asshole." The irony. By finally showing the footage, Carrey proved the exact opposite. Yes, he was kind of an asshole, but he was also fearless. Watching the documentary, you couldn't decide whether to call him a genius or a lunatic. Probably both. Hollywood, of course, tried to spin it. This is what great actors do. They suffer for their art. But most of the crew just rolled their eyes. Martin Freeman later roasted Carrey, calling the whole stunt selfish, narcissistic, and amateur. Imagine being dragged by the Hobbit. That's a new low. Still, Carrey had the last laugh. Jim and Andy earned critical praise, an Emmy nomination, and reminded audiences that the man behind the mask wasn't just a clown. He was willing to torch his own image to prove he was serious. So what's the takeaway? For nearly 20 years, Hollywood tried to keep Jim Carrey's dark side locked in a vault. But when the footage finally leaked, it didn't destroy him. It made him even more legendary. Because in Hollywood, being a little crazy isn't a liability, it's branding. Jim Carrey and Renee Zellweger, Hollywood's almost wedding that never happened. Hollywood romances are usually like cheap champagne, fizzy, flashy, and gone before the hangover wears off. But Jim Carrey and Renee Zellweger in the late 90s? That was supposed to be the real deal. The tabloids were already preparing wedding covers. Renee was trying on dresses. Jim was buying rings worth more than most people's houses. And then, poof! It all collapsed faster than a rom-com at the box office. It all started on the set of Me, Myself, and Irene in 1999. Carrey, already a megastar with a $20 million price tag per movie, decided he wanted Renee as his leading lady. Literally. He saw her photo and declared, "I will only shoot with her." Forget auditions. That's how Hollywood dating works when you're Jim Carrey. Their first meeting was pure chaos. Renee showed up with her dog, who immediately jumped into Jim's lap and peed all over his pants. Most people would have been horrified. Jim apparently thought it was fate. Renee later admitted she thought so too. When your dog urinates on a man and you still call it destiny, that's love, or at least Hollywood's version of it. Soon, they were inseparable. Renee moved into Jim's place and he showered her with gifts. We're not talking flowers and chocolates. We're talking a $60,000 engagement ring and designer furniture for her Los Angeles home. He was smitten. He even described her as real, not the type of actress obsessed with champagne parties, but the kind of woman who found joy in renting a U-Haul truck and moving furniture. Romantic. Maybe not, but at least it wasn't another Hollywood cliché. The press loved them. They were the couple. He was the king of comedy. She was America's quirky sweetheart. Together, they looked like a rom-com brought to life. The engagement rumors were everywhere. But then, as quickly as it began, the cracks appeared. Renee reportedly started planning the wedding. Jim reportedly started avoiding it. She wanted a date set in stone. He wanted more time. When Renee finally said, "Either we pick a date or we're done," Jim replied with the kind of romantic wisdom only Carrey could muster. "Do whatever you want." Translation: break up. And so, just like that, Hollywood's next royal wedding turned into another tabloid obituary. Rumors swirled. Renee wanted commitment. Jim was tired of proving his love daily. Some claimed she had too many complexes. He later admitted she was special, but apparently not special enough to walk down the aisle for. Looking back, it's one of those almost stories that Hollywood does so well. They had the chemistry, they had the headlines, they even had the dog pee meet cute. But they didn't have the ending. Instead of vows and rings, their love story became another reminder that in Hollywood, the brighter a romance burns, the faster it usually explodes. And for Jim Carrey and Renee Zellweger, the fairy tale stopped right before the altar. Jim Carrey and the P of Destiny Hollywood is full of bizarre love stories, but few can top the moment when Renee Zellweger's dog peed on Jim Carrey's lap. Yes, you read that correctly. Forget roses, candlelit dinners, or a dramatic kiss in the rain. For Jim and Renee, the spark was triggered by a puddle of dog urine. It all happened in 1999 on the set of Me, Myself, and Irene. Jim was already a superstar, cashing in $20 million paychecks and bending his face into rubber shapes for audiences worldwide. Renee was a rising star, the sweet Texan girl who would soon win Oscars and everyone's hearts. They were destined to meet, of course, but the universe decided to introduce them in the most awkward way possible. Renee showed up on set with her beloved dog, Wolf. Cute little sidekick, right? Wrong. Wolf had other plans. Within seconds, he jumped straight into Jim's lap and immediately relieved himself. on the trousers of one of Hollywood's biggest stars. The crew froze, Renee panicked, and Jim laughed. That's the thing about Carrey. Most people would storm off, demand new pants, and probably call their lawyer. Jim decided to see it as fate. Renee later recalled being mortified. This wasn't just a tiny accident. This was her dog baptizing Jim Carrey in front of the entire set. She thought it was a disaster. But then Jim smiled, shrugged it off, and basically said, "Well, I guess we were meant to meet this way." Suddenly, what could have been a humiliating moment turned into a cosmic sign. And in a way, it worked. The pee incident became their weird little meet-cute, the kind of ridiculous story that Hollywood screenwriters dream of. Instead of roses, Renee's dog gave Jim something far more memorable, and Jim, always the guy to find comedy in tragedy, embraced it. That ability to turn humiliation into humor is exactly what made him irresistible, and probably why Renee stuck around. Of course, tabloids had a field day. "Zellweger's dog marks his territory," screamed the gossip columns. Jokes flew about Jim being pissed on in love, but instead of denying it, the couple leaned into the story. Renee herself later admitted she thought it was fate. After all, what are the odds that your dog randomly picks Hollywood's biggest comedian to soak? Looking back, the dog pee incident says a lot about both of them. Renee, embarrassed but charmed. Jim, laughing off a public accident and turning it into romance. It was awkward, messy, and kind of gross, but also oddly sweet. In a business built on fake smiles and staged photo ops, here was something raw, real, and dripping with irony. Literally. Sure, their romance eventually fizzled out, as Hollywood romances tend to do. But the legend of Wolf the dog lives on. Because in the crazy love story of Jim Carrey and Renee Zellweger, the first move wasn't made by Jim or by Renee. It was made by her dog, and it left a puddle big enough to go down in Hollywood history. Jim Carrey. The critics. The day Rubberface wanted to snap necks, Jim Carrey has always been known for his elastic face and manic energy. But in 2001, after starring in Frank Darabont's The Majestic, audiences saw another side of him. The side that wanted to wring critics' necks like rubber chickens. The Majestic was Carrey's big swing at serious drama. No talking out of his butt, no green masks, no split personalities, just straight melodrama about patriotism, identity, and small-town America. It was Carrey's shot at finally proving, once and for all, that he was more than Hollywood's class clown. Think of it as his graduation ceremony from comedy kindergarten, but instead of applause, he got detention. Critics pounced on the film like starving wolves. Reviews called it too sentimental, unfocused, and in some cases just plain boring. For Carrey, who had poured his dramatic heart into the role, this wasn't just disappointing, it was a personal insult. And Jim Carrey doesn't do quiet disappointment, he does theatrical meltdowns. In one of his most infamous rants, he declared, "I would send to hell all the film critics who scolded The Majestic. Then I would start a new utopian society in which people would be like rubber dolls. I would wring the necks of the critics, and in a second their heads would be back in place." Yes, you read that correctly. Carrey basically fantasized about creating a dystopian theme park where critics could be strangled for sport, then magically reset like Stretch Armstrong dolls. Only Jim Carrey could turn a bad review into a cartoonishly violent monologue worthy of Looney Tunes. The statement was obviously tongue-in-cheek. Carrey wasn't actually planning to launch Critic Thunderdome. But it revealed just how deeply the reviews had cut him. For a man who made the world laugh, he was desperate to be taken seriously. And when he wasn't, the pain turned into comedy. Very dark comedy. Ironically, the very thing critics slammed him for, over-the-top earnestness, came roaring back in his defense of the movie. He cared too much, and he said too much. While most actors brush off bad reviews with a polite shrug, Carrey went nuclear, basically daring the press to keep mocking him. The backlash didn't destroy him, of course. Carrey bounced back with Bruce Almighty and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, both of which reminded audiences why he was still box office gold. But The Majestic remains a cautionary tale. Even comedy legends bleed when critics sharpen their pens. In the end, Carrey's rant wasn't just about one movie. It was about validation. He wanted to escape the cage of slapstick and be respected as an actor with depth. And when the critics slammed the door in his face, his frustration exploded in the most Jim Carrey way possible, a mix of cartoon violence, satire, and unfiltered honesty. So the next time you read a snarky review, just remember, Jim Carrey once dreamed of creating a world where critics' heads could be twisted off and snapped back on. Call it horrifying, call it hilarious, but admit it, you'd probably pay to watch. Jim Carrey and the $20,000 love note in the sky, Hollywood romances usually follow the same tired script. Flowers, paparazzi photos, and a quick breakup followed by a joint statement about remaining friends. But Jim Carrey never liked scripts, did he? When he dated Jenny McCarthy in the mid-2000s, he went so far over the top that even Cupid probably rolled his eyes. It was Valentine's Day, the holiday of overpriced roses and awkward dinners. Most boyfriends panic buy heart-shaped chocolates at the gas station. Jim Carrey, he hired a plane to write a love note in the actual sky above Los Angeles. That's right. While ordinary mortals scrambled for Hallmark cards, Jim was out there playing Zeus, scribbling his affection across the heavens for millions to see. The message was simple. J hearts J. Cute, right? Unless, of course, you're another celebrity named Jay who briefly thought Carrey was declaring his love for you. Jennifer Lopez probably had a moment of confusion. Justin Timberlake might have blushed. But no, the sky was reserved for Jenny McCarthy. This wasn't some cheap airplane banner at a baseball game either. We're talking professional skywriting, one of those absurd Hollywood gestures that costs more than most people's cars. Estimates put the stunt around $20,000, which is basically the celebrity version of buying a teddy bear. For Carrey, who was pulling in millions per movie, it was pocket change. For Jenny, it was proof that her boyfriend was as dramatic in love as he was on screen. And she loved it. For a while, Carrey and McCarthy were the golden couple of Hollywood. They looked perfect, the comedian with a heart of gold and the blonde bombshell who laughed at all his antics. They avoided marriage, proudly declaring they didn't need a piece of paper to prove their love. Carrey even quipped, "We'll never get married, but we'll never get divorced," which is fantastic. Cute line, Jim, though it didn't age particularly well, because, of course, like most Hollywood romances, the script eventually flipped. By 2010, the skywriting was just a memory, and the couple split. Jenny tweeted a graceful farewell, thanking Jim for the years they shared. Jim returned the kindness with a message of his own, wishing her the best. But behind the polite PR, fans speculated that the fairy tale had soured long before the credits rolled. Some blamed the stress of McCarthy's focus on her son's health. Others whispered about Jim's long battle with depression. Whatever the truth, the couple that once painted love across the sky eventually faded back into the Hollywood singles club. Still, you have to admit, Carrey's stunt remains one of the most memorable romantic gestures in celebrity history. It was outrageous, impractical, and wildly over the top. In other words, pure Jim Carrey. Because if there's one thing Rubberface knows, it's how to turn even Valentine's Day into a blockbuster spectacle. Sure, the relationship didn't last, but the image of J Hearts J floating above Los Angeles is forever burned into the skies of Hollywood legend. Come a Jim Carrey, the comedian who couldn't outrun the blues. Jim Carrey has made a career out of making people laugh until their faces hurt. He's the human cartoon, the man who could bend his body into slapstick chaos and light up a room just by twitching an eyebrow. But behind that manic energy and rubbery grin, Carrey has wrestled with something far darker: depression. For years, he kept it under wraps. After all, what's less funny than a comedian admitting he can't find joy? But eventually, Carrey came clean. On 60 Minutes, he admitted his mood swings weren't a quirky actor's temperament. They were the grinding ups and downs of depression. There are peaks, there are valleys, he said, but they're all carved out until it feels like a low level of despair you live in. Not exactly the kind of quote you'd expect from Ace Ventura. Like many, Carrey tried the pharmaceutical route. Prozac was his daily companion for a long time, and while it helped him climb out of the worst pits, he eventually ditched it. Why? Because, as he put it, life on Prozac made everything feel just okay. And Jim Carrey isn't a just okay kind of guy. This is the man who turned butt-talking into global box office. He doesn't do beige. Still, his openness was shocking at the time. In Hollywood, stars usually prefer to talk about their new diet, their yoga guru, or their green juice detox. Not Jim. He admitted publicly that depression was a significant part of his life. And in true Carrey fashion, he framed it in dark comedy. Life was a constant, low-level despair that he learned to surf like a wave. Who else could make clinical depression sound like a stand-up routine? Fans were surprised, but also oddly relieved. Here was one of the funniest men alive confessing that he, too, woke up some mornings feeling like the world had no color. If Jim Carrey could struggle, maybe it wasn't such a shameful thing after all. For once, his gift wasn't making people laugh. It was making them feel less alone. Of course, tabloids spun it their way. "Carrey cracks under pressure," screamed one headline. Others speculated that depression had sabotaged his relationships, from Renee Zellweger to Jenny McCarthy. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But what's clear is that Carrey wasn't afraid to expose the cracks in his clown mask. And that honesty, rare in a business built on Botox smiles, gave him a kind of credibility no Golden Globe could buy. In recent years, Carrey has doubled down on his openness, talking about mental health in interviews and even weaving it into his art and writing. He's less about being Hollywood's rubber-faced joker now, and more about being Hollywood's reluctant philosopher. So yes, Jim Carrey battled depression. Yes, he popped Prozac. And yes, he admitted life sometimes felt like one long grey day. But if nothing else, his story proves that even the man who made the world laugh the loudest wasn't immune to the silence of his own mind. Jim Carrey. From van life to a $28 million mansion, there's rags to riches, and then there's Jim Carrey. The guy who once lived in a Volkswagen van with his family went on to buy one of the most luxurious estates in Los Angeles. If that doesn't scream Hollywood irony, I don't know what does. Back in 1994, when Ace Ventura and The Mask made him the biggest comedy star on Earth, Carrey decided to celebrate the only way a newly minted millionaire could, by dropping $3.8 million on a Brentwood mansion. At the time, it was just another fancy purchase in the hills. But oh, how times change. That same mansion would later become a $28.9 million listing, because in Hollywood, even your house can have a comeback story. And what a house it was. We're talking 2 acres of California paradise, 11,000 square feet of don't-touch-anything luxury, 5 bedrooms, each the size of a New York apartment, a wine cellar that could make even the most dedicated AA sponsor cry, a private movie theater done up in Art Deco style, perfect for watching Jim's own films while muttering, "Yeah, I'm worth it." There was a waterfall pool, a meditation path, and gardens manicured so precisely they looked like they had their own Hollywood agents. Carrey lived in this mansion for nearly 3 decades. Imagine the stories those walls could tell. Wild parties, celebrity guests, maybe even a few Ace Ventura impressions echoing through the hallways at 2 a.m. But in 2023, Jim decided it was time to let go. He put the estate up for sale at a cool $28.9 million to fairy tale profit, right? Well, not quite. Apparently, Los Angeles real estate doesn't always play along with celebrity dreams. The house sat on the market, unsold, for months, then years. The price was slashed like a discount DVD bin, $26 million, $24 million, eventually dipping under $20 million. That's a nearly $10 million haircut. For a guy famous for wild facial contortions, this financial grimace had to sting. Still, even with the markdown, Carrey walked away with a profit. Buying for $3.8 million and selling for about $19.75 million? That's not failure. That's just less victory than expected. It's like opening weekend for a Carrey comedy in the 2000s. Maybe not the mask numbers, but hey, the studio still makes money. Of course, real estate wasn't his only splurge. Carrey also had a taste for expensive toys, like the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren, a car so flashy it basically screams midlife crisis every time you turn the key. For most people, buying a $400,000 car would be insane. For Jim, it was Tuesday. What makes it all so deliciously ironic is remembering where he started. The boy who once slept in a van ended up with a mansion that looked like a luxury resort. It's proof that Hollywood doesn't just give you fame, it gives you property portfolios, sky-high valuations, and the occasional headache when no one wants to pay your asking price. So yes, Jim Carrey took a hit on his Brentwood palace, but don't feel too sorry for him. When you can cry into your wine cellar and drive off in a McLaren, you're still doing better than 99.9% of the planet. Jim Carrey's Brentwood mansion, a comedian's castle with a waterfall. Jim Carrey has always been larger than life. His face stretches further than human anatomy should allow, his energy is nuclear-powered, and his movies have made billions. So of course, when it came to buying a house, he didn't settle for anything modest. No, Carrey bought himself a mansion so extravagant it could make a Saudi prince blush. Back in 1994, fresh off the success of The Mask and Ace Ventura, Jim dropped $3.8 million on a Brentwood estate. At the time, that was already a flex, but nearly 30 years later, the same property was worth almost $30 million. It wasn't a house, it was a statement. The funny guy from Canada now lives like royalty. So, what do you get when you turn fart jokes into fortune? Try 2 acres of prime Los Angeles land, hidden behind gates tall enough to keep out both paparazzi and ex-girlfriends. The house itself sprawls over 11,000 square feet. 5 bedrooms, each big enough to host their own reality show. But Jim wasn't content with just bedrooms and bathrooms. No, he built himself a private fantasy land. Let's start with the wine cellar. This wasn't a dusty basement with 2 bottles of Merlot. This was a full-blown temple of alcohol, perfect for celebrating Golden Globes or drowning sorrows after Razzie nominations. Then there was the Art Deco movie theater, so plush it could make AMC jealous. Imagine Jim Carrey sitting there in velvet seats, watching The Truman Show, and whispering to himself, "Damn, I nailed that one." Of course, no celebrity mansion is complete without a pool, but Carrey's wasn't just a pool, it came with a waterfall. Because when you're worth millions, regular chlorine water just isn't wet enough. The backyard looked like a luxury resort, complete with a meditation trail, because apparently even the king of slapstick needed a quiet stroll to find inner peace. And let's not forget the gardens. Perfectly manicured, they looked like they were styled by an A-list hairdresser. Every hedge seemed red carpet ready. If plants could smile, Carrey's roses would have worn veneers. But here's the twist. In 2023, Jim decided it was time to sell. He listed the property for $28.9 million. Buyers, however, weren't laughing. The price slowly tumbled. $26 million, then $24 million, eventually under $20 million. After almost 2 years, Carrey finally found a buyer, but only after slashing about $10 million off the original ask. That's the real estate equivalent of bombing on stage. Painful, but survivable. Still, before you feel sorry for him, remember, he bought it for $3.8 million. Selling it for nearly $20 million is what the rest of us call winning the lottery. It's not a tragedy, it's just not as big a jackpot as he expected. So while Jim Carrey may no longer live in his Brentwood castle, the legacy of his comedian's palace remains. It was loud, it was excessive, it was a little ridiculous. In other words, it was perfectly Jim Carrey. Bought Jim Carrey's mansion, from Hollywood dreamhouse to discount luxury. Jim Carrey has always been a man of extremes. On screen, his face stretches like a cartoon. Off screen, his wallet stretches just as far. But even Hollywood's funny man couldn't escape the cruel joke of Los Angeles real estate. In February 2023, Carrey decided to part ways with his Brentwood palace, the same estate he bought back in 1994 for a humble $3.8 million. Pocket change once The Mask and Ace Ventura turned him into box office royalty. Nearly 3 decades later, he listed the property for a jaw-dropping $28.9 million. Yes, $29 million for a house. But hey, this wasn't just a house. This was Jim Carrey's castle. And what a castle it was. 11,000 square feet of living space, enough room for all of Jim's alter egos to have their own bedrooms, a private movie theater, because of course Carrey needed a place to re-watch The Truman Show and remind himself of the time critics finally took him seriously. A wine cellar, perfect for drowning out the memory of the number 23. And let's not forget the pool with a waterfall, because apparently, in Hollywood, water doesn't count unless it falls dramatically over rocks. But the crown jewel was the meditation garden. That's right, the king of manic slapstick comedy had his own quiet trail for spiritual reflection. Imagine Ace Ventura in lotus pose. That's the kind of surreal image this mansion encouraged. Yet even with all this luxury, buyers didn't bite. Months passed, then a year. Carrey's listing sat there, like a comedian bombing on stage while the audience checks their phones. The price began to drop, from $28.9 million to $26 million, then $24 million, then $21 million. Finally, by late 2024, Carrey had to swallow the bitter punchline. The house sold for about $19.75 million. Now don't get me wrong, that's still a massive profit. From $3.8 million to nearly $20 million? Most of us would sell our souls for that kind of ROI. But in Hollywood math, this was less a triumph and more a humiliation. Losing $10 million off your asking price is like telling a joke and waiting 2 years for a single pity laugh. Painful. Of course, the tabloids had fun with it. Carrey's mansion flops harder than the cable guy. One headline joked. Others called it the discount dream house. But for Jim, the sale was less about money and more about moving on. After decades in the spotlight, he'd been downsizing his Hollywood presence anyway. The mansion was just another chapter he was closing. So yes, Jim Carrey didn't get his $28.9 million. But let's be honest, walking away with nearly $20 million for a house you bought in the 90s still sounds like the kind of punchline most people would kill for. In the end, Carrey once again proved that even when he loses, he's still laughing all the way to the bank. Jim Carrey and his Mercedes SLR McLaren, rubber-face meets supercar. When you think of Jim Carrey, you probably picture a man twisting his face like it's made of Play-Doh, or running around in a green mask yelling, "Smokin'!" What you probably don't imagine is Carrey behind the wheel of a machine so sleek and dangerous it looks like it belongs to James Bond on steroids. But yes, Jim Carrey, the man who once lived in a van, eventually upgraded to something a little shinier, the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren. For those who aren't car nerds, let's break it down. The SLR McLaren isn't just a car, it's a statement. Built from the unholy alliance of Mercedes-Benz and McLaren, the people who race in Formula One, not the guys who fix your Prius, this beast was one of the fastest and most expensive rides of its time. Price tag? Around $400,000 to $500,000, depending on the model. In other words, the kind of money most people spend on a house, Carrey spent it on something with 2 seats and no trunk space. And honestly, it makes sense. If anyone in Hollywood needed a car that could go from 0 to 60 in 3.4 seconds, it was Jim Carrey. After all, the man has spent his career moving at warp speed, both physically and emotionally. Watching him on screen is like watching a human Ferrari in overdrive. The SLR McLaren was basically his spirit animal on wheels. Picture it, Carrey roaring down Sunset Boulevard in a silver bullet, sunglasses on, probably practicing Ace Ventura impressions to horrify pedestrians. The SLR wasn't subtle. It had gull-wing-style doors that opened upwards, just in case the $400K price tag wasn't enough of a flex. Nothing says Hollywood royalty like stepping out of a car that looks like a spaceship designed for billionaires. Of course, the irony is rich. This is the same man who once scrubbed toilets to help his broke family survive, now zipping around Los Angeles in one of the most exclusive cars on the planet. From sleeping in a Volkswagen van to owning a Mercedes McLaren supercar, talk about a glow-up. But let's not pretend this was a practical purchase. The SLR isn't exactly a grocery getter. It guzzles gas like a frat boy downs beer, and parking it in LA traffic is like trying to land a private jet in a strip mall. Still, when you're Jim Carrey, practicality isn't the point. The point is, I can, so I did. The car joined a long list of Carrey's luxury splurges, including his Brentwood mansion with a waterfall pool and meditation trail. But while mansions are common in Hollywood, an SLR McLaren is pure flex. It said to the world, Jim Carrey isn't just the funny guy. He's the funny guy who can buy a car faster than your career. So yes, Jim Carrey owned a Mercedes SLR McLaren. And just like his comedy, it was loud, flashy, over the top, and unforgettable. In short, it was perfectly Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey's mansion, a Hollywood palace with a comedian's soul. Jim Carrey has always been a man of extremes. His comedy, wild. His face, elastic. His career, a roller coaster. So, of course, when it came time to buy a house, he didn't go for a modest bungalow. No, Carrey went full Hollywood and bought himself a palace in Brentwood. Back in 1994, Jim was riding high. The Mask and Ace Ventura had just catapulted him from struggling comic to box office king. So what does a newly minted millionaire do? He drops $3.8 million on a 2-acre estate in one of Los Angeles's most expensive neighborhoods. Forget a starter home. This was Carrey announcing to the world, the funny guy has arrived. And what a place it was. The mansion spread across 11,000 square feet. Big enough for Jim, his alter egos, and maybe even the Mask to all live separately. It came with 5 bedrooms, each the size of a Manhattan apartment, and enough bathrooms to make you wonder why a single human would ever need that many toilets. Of course, this wasn't just a house, it was a playground. Carrey's estate had a private movie theater designed in full Art Deco style. Picture Jim sprawled in velvet seats, watching The Truman Show and whispering, "Damn, that's good acting." There was also a wine cellar for celebrating Golden Globes or drowning sorrows after Razzie nominations. Outside, the backyard looked like a luxury resort. A pool with its own waterfall, a meditation trail, and gardens manicured to perfection. If plants could smile, Carrey's roses would have had veneers. For nearly 3 decades, this was Jim's sanctuary. The mansion witnessed his biggest highs, his messiest lows, and probably more than a few Hollywood parties that the neighbors still gossip about. It was loud, extravagant, and slightly ridiculous. In other words, perfectly Jim Carrey. But in 2023, the comedian decided to move on. He put the Brentwood Palace on the market for $28.9 million, and here's where the plot twisted. Buyers didn't line up. The house sat unsold. The price dropped. $26 million, $24 million, $21 million. By the end, Carrey had to accept around $19.75 million, almost $10 million less than he hoped for. Now, don't feel too bad for him. He bought the place for $3.8 million, walking away with nearly $20 million still makes him the guy laughing all the way to the bank. But in Hollywood terms, it wasn't the blockbuster ending he wanted, more like a box office hit that didn't quite break records. Still, the story of Jim Carrey's Brentwood mansion is classic Hollywood irony. The kid who once slept in a van grew up to own a palace with a waterfall in the backyard. And even when the market made him slash the price, he still pocketed a fortune. In the end, the mansion wasn't just real estate. It was a symbol. Proof that Jim Carrey didn't just conquer Hollywood with his rubber face. He literally built himself a kingdom, lived like royalty, and then sold the castle when it was time for the next act. Jim Carrey and the tragedy that nearly swallowed his career. For most of his life, Jim Carrey has been Hollywood's rubber-faced jester, the guy who could make an audience howl with laughter just by raising an eyebrow. But in 2015, the punchlines stopped. Instead, Carrey found himself at the center of one of the darkest, most scandalous chapters of his life, the tragic death of his girlfriend, Catriona White. Catriona was a young Irish makeup artist who had been dating Carrey on and off. In September 2015, she was found dead from an apparent overdose. It was shocking enough that one of the world's most famous comedians was suddenly connected to such a heartbreaking story. But the real storm came later. White's estranged husband and her mother filed wrongful death lawsuits against Carrey, claiming he had provided her with prescription drugs under a false name. Suddenly, headlines around the world weren't about The Mask or Dumb and Dumber. They were about whether Jim Carrey was responsible for a woman's death. The tabloids had a field day. The comedian who once danced in a tutu on screen was now splashed across front pages with words like lawsuit, drugs, and death hanging over his head. Carrey, of course, denied the accusations. He painted the lawsuit as nothing more than a cynical money grab. In a statement that sounded more like a courtroom mic drop, he said, "I will not tolerate this heartless attempt to exploit me or the woman I loved." Behind the bravado, though, you could sense the pain. The usually animated star looked drained, the sparkle in his eyes dimmed. Even for a man who'd made a career out of surviving humiliations on stage, this was a different kind of nightmare. The details only made the whole thing more surreal. Reports surfaced that Catriona had struggled with depression. There were claims of toxic relationships, messy breakups, and of course the infamous drugs under a fake name accusation. It read less like a court filing and more like a script for a Hollywood melodrama. Only this time, the laughs were gone. The lawsuits dragged on for years, hanging over Carrey's head like a storm cloud. It wasn't until January 2018 that the case was finally dismissed. All claims against Carrey were dropped, legally clearing him of any wrongdoing. But the damage to his public image had already been done. For a while, Carrey disappeared from the spotlight, retreating into painting, political cartoons, and cryptic interviews where he seemed like a man trying to put himself back together. In the court of law, Carrey walked free. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was messier. Some fans sympathized with him, pointing out that grief and love are complicated, that depression is a monster no celebrity can fix. Others couldn't shake the association between his name and the scandal. And so, one of Hollywood's brightest clowns found himself in the darkest of dramas. The tragic irony? The man who had spent his life making millions laugh was suddenly starring in a story nobody could smile about. Jim Carrey versus Kick-Ass. When Hollywood's funny man suddenly got serious, Jim Carrey has always been Hollywood's wild card. One moment he's talking out of his butt in Ace Ventura, the next he's winning a Golden Globe for The Truman Show. But in 2013, he pulled off one of his most unexpected acts yet. He turned his back on his own movie. The film was Kick-Ass 2, a bloody over-the-top comic book sequel where Carrey played a masked vigilante named Colonel Stars and Stripes. Imagine Batman, but with more swearing and a baseball bat. The movie was designed to be violent, outrageous, and gloriously offensive, exactly the kind of project you'd expect Carrey to embrace with his usual go big or go home energy. And he did, at first. Carrey filmed the role, did the stunts, wore the costume, and cashed the paycheck. But then something happened that changed everything. The Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. Suddenly, Jim Carrey, Hollywood's king of slapstick, decided he couldn't stomach being associated with a film that glorified guns and bloodshed. Weeks before the movie's release, he dropped a bombshell on Twitter. "I did Kick-Ass 2 a month before Sandy Hook, and now, in all good conscience, I cannot support that level of violence." Cue the meltdown. Fans were stunned. The studio was furious. Carrey's co-stars were left awkwardly promoting a movie their biggest star had just abandoned. It was like Batman quitting Gotham the night before the Joker shows up. The irony, of course, was delicious. Jim Carrey had signed on to a film literally called Kick-Ass. Nobody expected it to be a Disney musical. The entire franchise was built on excessive violence. That was the point. And now its biggest star was pearl-clutching about the very thing audiences were paying to see. Critics pounced, accusing Carrey of hypocrisy. "If you're so against violence, why take the role in the first place?" they asked. The internet dragged him for collecting his fee and then trashing the movie. The studio released polite statements through gritted teeth, and fans split down the middle. Some applauded him for taking a moral stand, others rolled their eyes and told him to save the sermon. Carrey, as usual, doubled down. He refused to do press for the film, left his co-stars to handle awkward interviews, and essentially ghosted his own blockbuster. It was one of the rare times Hollywood got to watch a star not just bite the hand that feeds him, but gnaw on it publicly in front of millions of Twitter followers. In the end, Kick-Ass 2 came out, made its money, and then fizzled into the bargain bin of superhero sequels. Carrey walked away with his bank account intact, and his conscience, allegedly, clear. But the episode left a permanent mark on his image. Suddenly, Jim Carrey wasn't just the rubber-faced clown. He was also the guy who could turn into Hollywood's moral preacher at the drop of a hat. So what's the lesson here? Simple. If you hire Jim Carrey for your ultra-violent comic book movie, don't be surprised if he later condemns it from his meditation garden. After all, this is the man who can make us laugh until we cry, and then cry until the studio does. Jim Carrey and the anti-vax plot twist. Nobody asked for Jim Carrey has always been unpredictable. One minute he's making faces in Ace Ventura, the next he's winning awards for The Truman Show. But in the late 2000s, Carrey shocked fans with a plot twist no one expected. He swapped rubber-faced comedy for anti-vaccine activism. Yes, Hollywood's clown prince went full conspiracy mode. The story begins with his relationship with Jenny McCarthy. At the time, she wasn't just a TV personality, she was also one of the loudest voices in the anti-vax movement, claiming vaccines caused her son's autism. Enter Jim Carrey, hopeless romantic, always ready to support his partner. Except instead of buying roses or writing a love song, Jim picked up a megaphone and joined the crusade. In 2008, the couple marched at the Green Our Vaccines rally in Washington, D.C. Carrey stood there, side by side with McCarthy, demanding that vaccines be stripped of toxic substances. It was part protest, part publicity stunt, and part surreal comedy sketch. Imagine Lloyd Christmas from Dumb and Dumber lecturing scientists about immunology. That's pretty much what the public saw. The backlash was immediate. Medical experts slammed Carrey for spreading misinformation. Parents accused him of fueling fear that put children at risk. And critics couldn't believe that the man who once wore a tutu and wrestled an alligator was suddenly trying to rebrand as a public health authority. It was like watching the class clown storm the principal's office with a biology textbook upside down. Carrey, of course, insisted he wasn't anti-vaccine. No, he was pro-safe vaccine. But that nuance didn't matter. The headlines stuck. Jim Carrey, the funny guy, was now the face of Hollywood's anti-vax circus. For someone who had built a career making the world laugh, This was the moment when many stopped laughing. The irony was painful. This was a man who had entertained millions with zany, harmless comedy, now tied to a movement accused of endangering children's lives. His reputation took a hit. Interviews got awkward. Scientists rolled their eyes. The public scratched their heads and wondered, is this real life or just another Jim Carrey performance? Eventually, after his breakup with McCarthy, Carrey backed away from the movement. He stopped showing up at rallies, stopped tweeting about toxins, and tried to steer the conversation back toward art, acting, and even political cartoons. But the damage lingered. To this day, whenever someone lists Hollywood's weirdest conspiracy moments, Carrey and McCarthy's vaccine crusade is right there near the top. In the end, the anti-vax chapter of Jim Carrey's life felt like one of his stranger roles. Only this time, there was no script, no director, and definitely no punchline. For fans, it was a reminder that even comedy legends can wander into drama. For critics, it was proof that not every Hollywood star should try to improvise science. Because, let's be honest, Jim Carrey may know how to bend his face like rubber, but epidemiology? Not exactly his best impression. Jim Carrey, the day Hollywood tried to hide his madness. In Hollywood, method acting usually means refusing to shower for a role or insisting on being called by your character's name at Starbucks. But when Jim Carrey took on Andy Kaufman in Man on the Moon, 1999, he went so far off the deep end that Universal Pictures allegedly tried to bury the evidence. Carrey didn't just play Kaufman, he became Kaufman. For months, day and night. On set, off set, at lunch, in the makeup chair. The Jim Carrey everyone knew vanished, replaced by Andy and Kaufman's obnoxious alter ego, Tony Clifton. And it wasn't cute. Crew members described the atmosphere as a hostage situation with craft services. Milos Forman, the poor director, spent as much time negotiating with Andy as he did actually directing the movie. Carrey later admitted he made everyone miserable. He hurled insults at the crew in character, mocked executives, and pushed stunts so far that the line between performance and harassment blurred. It was part tribute, part psychotic episode, and part live-action prank. Hollywood called it method acting. Everyone else just called it hell. Of course, cameras were rolling. A documentary crew captured hours of behind-the-scenes footage. Carrey refusing to break character, tormenting colleagues, and living in Kaufman's skin like a man possessed. And when the film wrapped, Universal allegedly freaked out. They shelved the tapes, worried that if the world saw what Carrey had been up to, the lovable comedian's career would implode. Imagine headlines reading, Jim Carrey turns into Andy Kaufman, forgets to be human. Not exactly the PR campaign a studio dreams of. And so, the footage sat hidden for almost 2 decades. Until 2017, when Netflix finally unleashed it in Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond. Suddenly, the world got a front-row seat to the madness Universal tried to keep under wraps. The documentary showed Carrey describing the experience as a kind of possession. Andy came back from the dead, inhabited my body, and carried on. Depending on your perspective, this was either genius or grounds for psychiatric evaluation. Fans were fascinated, critics were divided, and fellow actors mostly rolled their eyes. Martin Freeman famously trashed Carrey's antics as selfish, narcissistic, and amateur. Translation: great for headlines, terrible for co-workers. Watching the footage, you couldn't decide whether Carrey had given the performance of a lifetime or simply hijacked an entire film production in the name of art. What's certain is that Universal's instincts weren't wrong. The footage painted Carrey as both brilliant and unbearable, a man willing to torch his own reputation for the sake of authenticity. And honestly, that contradiction has always been the essence of Jim Carrey. So yes, Hollywood did try to bury the meltdown. But when it finally came out, it didn't destroy Carrey. If anything, it added another bizarre chapter to his myth. The comedian who once lived in a van had become a superstar, then a human cartoon, Then, briefly, Andy Kaufman's ghost. Only Jim Carrey could turn a buried scandal into a Netflix hit. And only in Hollywood could insanity be rebranded as art. Jim Carrey versus Donald Trump. When Rubberface became a political cartoon, Jim Carrey has always been a man who pushes boundaries. On screen, he pushed his face until it looked like elastic. Off screen, he eventually pushed his politics into full-blown performance art. And no one got more of the Carrey treatment than Donald J. Trump. For decades, Carrey had been known as Hollywood's lovable goofball, but by the late 2010s, he traded in slapstick for sketch pads. Instead of making us laugh in theaters, he was making us wince and sometimes cheer with savage caricatures of America's most polarizing president. His Instagram became less behind-the-scenes celebrity and more front-row seat at the resistance. And Carrey didn't hold back. One of his favorites? Portraying Trump as a literal reptile. Not figuratively slimy, not just snake-like in spirit, an actual reptilian, with scaly skin, sunken eyes, and a stretched jaw. According to Carrey, Trump wasn't just corrupt or incompetent. He was barely human. The joke played right into conspiracy theory territory, and naturally it went viral. But Jim wasn't done. At one point, he even filmed himself fake coughing on Trump during a mock press conference. Yes, while the world was trying to deal with pandemic-level paranoia, Carrey was leaning into slapstick political satire, turning the White House briefing room into his personal stage. The clip ricocheted across social media. Half the internet laughed, the other half fumed, and Trump supporters demanded Carrey stick to making funny faces. The reaction was classic Jim Carrey chaos. Some praised him as an artist finally telling truth to power. Others said he had completely lost the plot. What's clear is that the once family-friendly comedian had reinvented himself as a political cartoonist with a vendetta. And like all things Carrey, it was impossible to ignore. Hollywood, of course, had mixed feelings. Some colleagues applauded his guts. Others quietly wished he'd go back to slapstick and stop turning Instagram into a gallery of presidential grotesques. But Carrey didn't care. He leaned in, drawing Trump as a monster, a dictator, even as a golf-addicted toddler in diapers. It was outrageous, unsubtle, and very, very Jim. The irony? Carrey himself admitted in interviews that he didn't really know if this political phase was art, therapy, or just another role he couldn't shake. Maybe all three. But what he did know was that he couldn't keep quiet. For a man who once made millions talking out of his backside, suddenly speaking his mind felt like destiny. In the end, Carrey's Trump obsession was less about politics and more about performance. He turned Instagram into his stage, turned markers into props, and turned the president into his ultimate straight man. Whether you saw it as brave or bonkers, one thing was undeniable. Jim Carrey, the clown prince of Hollywood, had evolved into the court jester of American politics. And if you didn't like his jokes, well, as Carrey might say, somebody stop me. Jim Carrey versus Tommy Lee Jones. When Gotham turned into a comedy club war, Hollywood loves on-screen rivalries. Batman versus Joker, Superman versus Lex Luthor. But in 1995, the real battle wasn't scripted. It was happening behind the scenes of Batman Forever. And no, it wasn't Val Kilmer brooding in the Batcave. It was Jim Carrey and Tommy Lee Jones locked in a feud so bizarre it could have been its own spin-off movie, When the Riddler Met Two-Face. Carrey, fresh off Ace Ventura and The Mask, was the hottest comedy star in the world. His role as the Riddler was perfectly in line with his wild energy, manic, colorful, and completely over the top. Enter Tommy Lee Jones, Hollywood's grumpy grown-up, cast as Two-Face. He was fresh from an Oscar win for The Fugitive and wasn't exactly in the mood to clown around. You can probably see where this is going. According to Carrey, it all came to a head one night when he bumped into Jones at a restaurant. Expecting some friendly co-star chit-chat, Jim approached the veteran actor. What he got instead was the verbal equivalent of a slap across the face. Jones allegedly looked him dead in the eye and growled, I hate you. I really don't like you. I cannot sanction your buffoonery." And just like that, the feud was born. Imagine walking up to a colleague for a handshake and getting hit with Shakespearean-level disdain. Carrey was stunned. The line, "cannot sanction your buffoonery," became Hollywood legend. If there were awards for classy insults, Jones would have walked away with another Oscar that night. The tension carried on to the set. Carrey, in full green spandex, bouncing off walls with riddles and riddles, while Jones simmered with barely concealed rage, probably dreaming of being anywhere else. Their dynamic as villains on screen, one wild, one deadly serious, wasn't acting. It was just them. The Riddler and Two-Face really did hate each other. For Carrey, it was baffling. He later told interviewers that Jones simply couldn't stand his style, his comedy, or maybe just his existence. For Jones, it was simple. He was a serious actor, and Carrey's cartoonish antics rubbed him the wrong way. He didn't want to share a frame with Hollywood's new clown prince. Ironically, their mutual dislike gave Batman Forever exactly what it needed. Villains who didn't quite gel, constantly trying to one-up each other. It worked on screen, but backstage, it was less buddy comedy and more Cold War. In hindsight, the feud has become one of those delightful Hollywood anecdotes, the kind that proves even big stars aren't immune to petty workplace drama. Fans still quote Jones's legendary insult like it's poetry. Carrey, for his part, laughs about it now. After all, what better compliment for a comedian than to annoy a co-star so much he publicly declares war on your buffoonery? So yes, Gotham survived the Riddler and Two-Face. But backstage, Batman Forever will always be remembered as the set where Jim Carrey's high-energy comedy smashed headfirst into Tommy Lee Jones's granite face. And neither actor has let anyone forget it.